Hello. Good afternoon, good morning to those of you joining us today. My name is John Thies, the CEO and co-founder of Email and Asset. And thank you for joining us for How to Master Deliverability in Email. I'm really excited today for the gentleman that we have on the line with us that we get to talk about deliverability. We have Tim Moore and Chris Arundel. But first, quickly, let me just walk through some housekeeping, organizing things for you guys. So before we begin, if you guys have any audio issues, please let us know. There should be a questions box there with this webinar. So please feel free to write that in if you can't hear us or there's problems. We are also going to be doing a Q&A at the end. So as we're going through, if you have any questions, please feel free to write those in. As Kristen here will be kind of keeping track of those, and we'll answer those as they're received at the end. And we are also recording this video, this webinar. So if you weren't able to make it, or you have some more questions about it, don't worry, we'll be sending you guys out an email within 2 to 3 business days with the recording to this webinar. So to get right into it, let me just introduce who we have with us on the line here. We have Tim Moore, as I mentioned, from 250OK. So he has a ton of experience in the email industry. He was recently at Return Path. Now he was on the ESPs, and now he gets the pleasure of working with the folks over there at 250OK, who tracks everything from deliverability as far as performance and all that. And then we have Chris Arundel from Inbox Pros, who's coming all the way from Atlanta, who has 16 years of experience. Inbox Pros has been around for a while. They help clients with deliverability problems, helping them figure out what the issues are and how to avoid some of the common issues that we're going to be walking through today. So thank you guys for being with us. But first, what we're going to be doing here too is we're going to be having some poll questions. And what I'd like everyone to do is, kind of take a minute and just answer these poll questions. Those will help us guide us through the conversation. And the first one is, and let me pop it up here real quick. What is deliverability? So you guys can see those there. Looks like we had 86% says messages that make it to the inbox, 9% is the messages that don't bounce, and then 5% of what my ESP does. And so, Tim, what exactly is deliverability?
Well, our recipients here got it correct with the poll. So there are 2 very similar sounding terms here that have 2 very different meanings, and they often get confused. The first is delivery, and delivery is exactly what is shown here on the poll as the first option. So that's messages that don't bounce. So out of all the messages that are attempted, delivery would be how many are actually delivered. And deliverability itself is one step beyond that. So deliverability itself is what happens once the message is actually delivered. Where does it go? Does it make it to the inbox, or does it land in the spam folder? And that's where deliverability actually comes into play. And so that's correct here on the quick poll. Messages that make it to the inbox.
Awesome. So let me just close this poll so we can get back to the slide. Yeah, I know that's delivery and deliverability is a well-known question that we all get. And so is deliverability, Tim, a new email concept? Like, is it a new concept in email?
No, it isn't a new concept in email. It's really been around for quite some time. I would say the definition of it is evolving and improving, and really what's driving that change is really visibility. I would say the biggest change in the email landscape within, say the past decade or so since I've been in the industry is really visibility. There's just more data to absorb.
Gotcha. And then so when we're talking about deliverability and we're bringing all this up, so what does it mean to have good deliverability?
So at its core, it really means being able to reach the inbox of your recipient. So that's really going to be the core definition of having good deliverability. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than just that, and there are a lot of factors that determine whether or not you do have good deliverability. But at its core, it means being able to land in the inbox at a very high level and at a high rate.
So in getting the inbox level, we talked about, we've in the past where we talked about, text-only versions and image to text ratios. Is like if you add plain text versions to your email, is that a positive? Does that give you a better deliverability rate?
That's an interesting topic, and I can't say with 100% certainty what the answer is here. But what I would advise marketers on the line here is there's no harm in adding a plain text version. It's fairly easy to do, and there's no scenario where adding that is going to cause harm. So in the absence of a benefit, I would say that it certainly is not going to be detrimental to you. So I would certainly advise people to do that. Whether or not it's beneficial, I think that's something that is probably up for debate, but it certainly won't ever result in a scenario where it is going to cause harm. So just based on that, I would say absolutely go forward with that.
So when we talk about inbox placement, is it realistic? So I'm a marketer and I want to send out my email campaigns. Like, is it realistic to get perfect inbox placement or 100% inbox on campaigns that I send out?
No, it really isn't realistic to have 100% inbox placement rate. There are just too many variables that can get in the way of achieving that. Ultimately, when we talk about kind of that delivered versus deliverability, the delivered rate alone is never going to be 100% because there will be messages that bounce. Now, when we talk about the deliverability rate, there are also variables that are going to prevent that from ever being 100%. Let's take Gmail, for example. If you are sending to a recipient at Gmail that has not engaged with your email, and by engaged I mean opened or clicked, in a significant amount of time, it's likely that particular message is going to go to the spam folder for that recipient. Take someone like Yahoo into an account in a scenario where maybe a particular recipient has complained about a message from you. Ensuing communications that you attempt to deliver to that recipient are likely to end up in the spam folder. So when you just take all those variables into account, it's nearly impossible to get to that 100% inbox rate that I know everyone wants to achieve.
So if you can't get 100% inbox placement that I want, right? So how can I get it so that, like, or what do you consider a good deliverability rate?
I think that's a very subjective question, and what I would advise the marketers on the line to take into account when they're measuring that is looking at their own past performance. And so really your benchmark isn't necessarily all those in the industry. The benchmark is your own past performance, and what you want to do is you want to improve. So you want to identify areas of improvement within your own marketing program, address those, and then watch your own placement rates start to increase and improve. And that's really what the objective is.
Okay, perfect. So Chris, I direct this question to you. So, as technology has evolved, have spam filters evolved with that? And then what new challenges are we now facing or having to deal with when sending emails?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Absolutely. Spam filters have evolved as technology has evolved. I equate it to a cat and mouse game, right? So if somebody has built a system to keep up with the spam that's coming in, spammers are going to try to, skirt around that and come up with new tactics that spam filters have to, of course, modify and adjust to combat that spam. And so things such as, some of the engagement level filtering that we've been talking about, it's not just about content filtering anymore. There's so much going on with spam and phishing emails that spam filters have to keep up and have to evolve in order to keep marketers on top of their game, but also make sure that the recipients' mailboxes are clean and of course, not full of spam or phishing emails.
Okay. So you mentioned marketers on top of their game. So getting into that, what is the responsibility of a marketer from the deliverability perspective?
I would say that email marketers should be responsible for the majority of their deliverability. When they're using a platform, an email service provider or a marketing automation provider, those systems will set up authentication records, SPF, DKIM, possibly DMARC, work with you in your IT department to make sure that's set up properly and passing. They have the infrastructure set up for either dedicated IPs or shared IPs. They may work with you in an onboarding process or IP warming process, monitoring your sends, making sure things are okay. But then it's the email marketer's responsibility to take it a step further and make sure their content is relevant, it's clean, it's concise. Their list, email marketer's list, is clean, engaged, segmented. That's the marketer's responsibility. And I would say worrying about cadence and frequency is also the marketer's responsibility. That really goes along with the expectation of the email recipient. If somebody signed up for your marketing newsletter or coupon and they expect to receive 1 email a week, frequency and cadence is very important, and that does play into email deliverability too, and that falls on the shoulders of the email marketer. So it's really a partnership, deliverability of the email marketer with the system or service that you're using to send email, but it's ultimately your responsibility to make sure that the list, content, relevancy, frequency is working and is, again, on top of your game to make sure that there's no problems or issues that may get you blacklisted, may get you sent to the junk folder, or may run into other problems.
And you may, and that's a lot of stuff that we have to consider, right? And so talking about this kind of list maintenance, right? And so a question that I get asked a lot is, and either one of you guys can jump on this, but someone comes and asks you, okay, hey, I want to get better at email marketing, and we all heard the statistics about how every dollar spent gets a $40 return, but so I want to do that, and I want to go build my list really quickly, so I want to go buy a list. What do you guys say to that?
So I can jump in with my first thought on that. I would say that, objectively speaking, it is much harder to successfully deliver a list where there isn't any permission, and that would be the scenario when you're talking about a purchase list. So I think something that is already complex, because deliverability is relatively complex on its own, becomes infinitely more complex when you add a variable such as that. Trying to send to a list without permission, you're just going to run into a wide variety of reputation issues that are going to make deliverability very, very challenging.
And I would also add to that, oftentimes when I'm working with a client, I'll ask them, would you be okay with receiving the same email from a brand that you've never heard of, or possibly receiving multiple emails that you have no idea who it's from? What would you typically do with an email that went into your inbox and you have no idea who it is? And the response normally is, I wouldn't like that. I would hit the spam button or just delete it. And so it's oftentimes just kind of putting things into perspective that sending to a purchase list, albeit maybe a good idea or good thought in the beginning, but it may be in the long term difficult, because if you start to get a lot of complaints, hard bounces, people just ignoring your message or deleting it without reading it, engagement, reputation, and deliverability on the IPs and domains that you're sending from are just going to drop and decrease. And let's say 30 days later, you're looking at your metrics, and that 25% open rate that you may have gotten in the beginning is now down to 2, and it's very difficult to come back from something like that.
And I think that's a key point there, is sustainability. And when you're talking about a purchase list, it just isn't a sustainable approach.
So don't do it, right? Whatever you can, don't go to eBay and buy a disc of email addresses for $20, right?
Oh, you get what you pay for, right? So.
Okay. So you mentioned, Chris, your reputation drops, and you guys have kind of talked about that. So what is deliverability reputation?
I kind of equate that to your first day of high school. So you walk in your first day of high school, you get to reinvent yourself, right? So are you going to be a football player? Are you going to be in the band? Are you going to be in the glee club, which I don't know if that exists anymore. But it's really... Yeah, I think I am. You get to invent yourself, and that's where reputation comes in. So if you've got good grades, if you're good attendance, if you're making good friends, not getting in trouble or going to detention, then you have a good reputation. And I equate that to, a new IP address or a new domain. Setting everything up properly with authentication, DNS records, and infrastructure, but then when you start sending, stepping out with your best foot forward. And not only is it about IP reputation anymore, it's also about domain reputation. Both IP and domain reputation do play into deliverability. It used to be the case that you could jump from IP address to IP address without a problem. Your domain really wasn't something that was really carefully looked at, where of course now that's changed. Your sending domain, image path domains, landing page domains, all those taken into consideration build up a reputation of what you're sending. So if you're sending to good quality leads with good quality and clean content, reputation should be high and stay high, and it's something that marketers should strive for. On the flip side, not doing proper IP warming, not doing proper segmentation, or maybe sending to those purchase lists, you may be stepping out with poor reputation, and it could become the factor of emails going straight to the junk folder.
And one variable there that's really interesting when it comes to email reputation is that just due to the nature of the email landscape, mailbox providers and spam filters are really forced to take a guilty until proven innocent approach when it comes to seeing new IPs and new domains. And so the takeaway there is that it does take a long time and a lot of effort to establish good sending reputation, but it can be destroyed in a very short amount of time, and that's just the nature of the game right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing. And so the question I have for you guys then, my next question would be is like, when you talk about, Chris, you guys talked about keeping it clean, keeping it engaged, so is it okay to keep sending to the subscribers on your list if they haven't, opened it or clicked on anything in it, but it hasn't bounced in 6+ months?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so difficult, right? Because the best practice is, hey, if it's somebody hasn't opened or clicked in 6 months or 12 months, or depending upon your cadence and frequency, just maybe stop sending to them. Send them a different type of message, push them to social media, something, right? And so that's kind of an easy sort of cop-out. Just segment your list and you'll get back in the inbox. The problem with that, or the flip side, is you start to also look at data that says, okay, well, you haven't sent them the right sort of content, that you haven't really got them interested in an offer, or the email itself isn't interesting, where they're not going to open, click, or convert. And so sometimes it does go back to the content. It does go back to the expectation of, are you receiving 1 email or 10 in a week? And so again, I have seen facts and figures that point to people that may open an email 18 months later and buy. Some people that open an email 2-3 years later and buy. And so it's difficult to kind of just say, yeah, segment your list and you'll get in the inbox, which of course that is true. Sending to recent, relevant, engaged openers and clickers does help with inbox placement pretty quickly at the major providers, just because it's a numbers game. If you are sending to 90% openers or clickers, yeah, you should see high inbox placement. And if you cut half your list, yeah, that's, again, high inbox placement. But what about those other buyers that could be buyers that you stop sending to? And so working with clients, I'll look at the list, the segments, the content, the types of offers, and not just segmenting people out to segment them out due to unengaged or due to low opens or clicks. It's sending them a different piece of creative, a different piece of content. And oftentimes it could be a breakup email, right? So, I'm sorry I may have offended you, or, have you been eaten by an alligator and we haven't heard from you? Something that makes it enticing and interesting, so that way they're like, oh yeah, I do want to stay engaged with you, or no, I want to be off the list because I'm following you on Facebook or LinkedIn or any of the other social media networks. But again, at the same time, and I'll let Tim talk about this because I'm sure he has some things to say, but sending to older email addresses that haven't opened or clicked could also be problematic, because you could be hitting spam traps, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later. But spam traps do affect you; they can hurt your reputation and deliverability, and so that is something we also have to factor in.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think Chris really hit 2 important points there. Number one is look at the data. You really do have to evaluate the data. You have to look at the signals that your recipients are providing you, whether those are positive or negative signals. And by that I mean in terms of positive signals, things like opens and conversions and clicks. Negative signals being unsubscribes and complaints. Look at those things. And then I would say the second thing that Chris really hit on here was develop a strategy based on that data. When somebody has a strategy of just not emailing to those who haven't opened or clicked in X amount of time, to me that isn't necessarily a strategy. That's more just a policy. And so what's more effective there is really developing a strategy based on the signals that you are seeing from your actual recipients. And as Chris mentioned, there are a lot of different variables there that make it more complex than just saying we're not going to send to somebody who hasn't opened or clicked in the last 6 months. You have to take into account frequency. If you're a monthly mailer versus a daily mailer, those are two very different contact strategies. So really, it isn't just a one-size-fits-all model, and that's where having consultants such as Chris is really valuable because they can help you really weaponize all these data signals that are available.
I think that's really interesting you talk about data because I look at, so one thing that we do here at Email and Ask with that too is we actually really track the unsubscribes and the non-engagement to try to get a gauge, an average of when people aren't engaged anymore, and we try to follow up with them then to try to re-engage them. If they're not, then we just get them out. Then we just essentially kick them out because we'll try, and then we look at that data, and we that's one of our major KPIs that we say is, okay, how engaging are we as a brand? And we look at that data and we take it and then we try to re-engage people and try to extend that engagement time so that it's smaller and smaller, but then once it gets to that point, then we reach out to them again. And so when we talk about engagement, are there ISPs, such like AOL, Yahoo, Outlook, Gmail, do they monitor engagement? Are they tracking how long someone's viewing your email and what they're clicking on?
Well, the interesting thing is that we loosely use this term called engagement, and ISPs and marketers really think about engagement differently. There are a lot of signals that the ISPs monitor and look at that marketers don't get access to. They don't have that information. For instance, Gmail, Hotmail, all these major ISPs, they will look at how long somebody's reading the mail for. Did they open it and save it? Did they star it? Did they, move it out of the junk folder? All of these signals that I know marketers would love to get a hold of that data because it would help them with their segmentation strategies, but it's not necessarily all about an open and a click. There are other factors of engagement that marketers just don't get based upon data rights and privacy and security that ISPs, hold close to their chest. So, again, Gmail can see that Sally Smith at gmail.com read the message for 10 seconds, she starred it, she moved it to a folder, all of these metrics that are part of the engagement algorithm and formula, it's just marketers don't have access to it.
And so they're doing it, but they're looking at like a history though too with an email or with a domain, correct?
Yeah, they're looking at the history, they're looking at patterns, they're looking at fingerprinting with content. So if, for instance, all of a sudden, the email from Delta now looks like it's coming from AirTran, which is no longer in business, and it has AirTran's logo. Okay, did somebody get hacked? Is it a phishing email? Something like that, because they have to take that in consideration as part of their formulas for inbox placement. So it's not just necessarily, okay, well, the HTML is clean and pretty, let's get it into the inbox. No, it's history of the mailbox, what's actually happening. Is this person really a recipient, or are they a zombie mailbox that was maybe set up to just get receipts only, right? So I'm sure the majority of us on the call have our buying email address. So hey, we just want receipts to go to one email address, and we want our mom to email us on another one. And so is it truly a mailbox that's used for marketing messages or daily communications, or could it be one of those mailboxes that just accepts mail and nobody ever opens or clicks in it?
And that's really
go
ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that, and that's really a key point there, is that the definitions are entirely different. When a marketer is talking about an engaged recipient, they're talking about an address that is opening or clicking their email. When an ISP is talking about an active recipient, they're really referring to is the account itself active. So those are two very, very different definitions of engagement.
And so with engagement, kind of like the next question I have for you guys is, and Chris, you kind of mentioned it a minute ago, like with spam traps and stuff, but Tim, maybe I'll direct this question to you, is like, so what impact does non-engagement have on deliverability, like sending to inactives?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly increases your deliverability risk. So you certainly run increased risk of running into reputation issues as you go into an unengaged file. So what you'll see is you'll see a higher probability of an address bouncing, which is certainly a negative reputation signal. You'll see a higher likelihood of hitting a spam trap, which is certainly another negative reputation signal. And then what you will see is as you go deeper into the file, as people do open the email, so maybe you did get somebody to open who hadn't previously opened, the probability of them complaining or unsubscribing becomes higher. So there are a lot of risks associated with going deeper into file, and that doesn't mean that you don't want to do it at all. You just want to do it intelligently, and you do want to have a strategy when it comes to sending to inactives. And you do want to certainly do it less frequently than you would mail to your active file.
So based on what you guys are saying, it's not the bigger the list, the better. It's how you use it and how clean it is, right? Essentially.
Yes, precisely. And I would also kind of echo Tim's comments, the fact that, you know, here in a couple weeks we have a few major holidays coming up, and it always seems to be that, you know, marketers do want to go back into that file and send to 8-year-old email addresses because they may want to buy that Christmas tree that you know is going on sale. And so I would just caution the fact that, you know, things like volume increases and you know, file increases, increased use of lists that's, you know, less engaged could be problematic from a deliverability perspective, but also possibly for a spam trap hit, blacklist hit, bounce hit, complaint hit perspective. Overall, that will impact deliverability. And so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that, you know, it requires planning, and it requires different levels of engaged content and less frequency than your active users.
Interesting. So you guys have mentioned frequency a couple of times. So getting to the next poll question is that I'd like everyone to kind of fill out is like, what is your send frequency? How often are you sending to your subscribers? So as you guys can see, it looks like 32% of you guys say you only send it once a month, 53% say 4 to 5 times a week, and then 15 is as many times necessary to hit my revenue numbers. Really interesting. So that's really good feedback to have. And so to you guys, one question, so with that in mind, when we talk about send frequency, there's been a lot of talk about kind of the email marketing industry about how to send more email. Right, because it's a whole thing about marketers to be the top of mind. And so for you guys, and you know, Tim, maybe I'll start with you. I have 2 questions. Like, do you agree with that? And then if marketers do that, what do they have to be aware of from a deliverability perspective?
Well, I think this goes back to a point we made earlier about list purchase, which is just not a sustainable practice. I would say the same probably applies to the whole sending more is better approach. I do think that in some cases you may see a short-term return, an increase in revenue, but it just isn't a sustainable strategy. As you start to run into some of those reputation issues that come with that strategy down the road, you do run the risk of detrimental inbox placement. Once you hit that point, it's really difficult to get out of that. And so I would say that my overall recommendation and approach here is that it really should be about the quality more than the quantity, because I just don't think that quantity is a sustainable approach.
Yeah, and I agree. I think, you know, there's a little asterisk right next to send more email, right? And it's sending good quality content to a good clean list, not of unengaged subscribers. So there's always kind of a caveat to sending more emails. And again, it really depends upon the expectation. Again, if I sign up for a daily email, the expectation is I'm going to receive a daily email. If I sign up once a week and now I'm getting 2 a week, 3 a week, 4 a week, there's a problem. The expectation has been broken. Is there some sort of is there a reason why I'm getting more? Am I getting partner emails now or affiliate emails? that's where it could become problematic. And I often work with clients to say, well, let's build out a preference center to have people maybe opt down or choose different types of newsletters, different types of emails, as well as, push them to social. If somebody does want to, get off your email list, push them to Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Have all those links on your preference page or your unsubscribe page, so that way it gives them the opportunity to still stay a fan and be an evangelist for your brand, but to get off the email list because maybe they don't check it as often or the frequency is just too much.
And Tim, you kind of mentioned something there too that kind of leads us to the next question: is does consistency matter when you're sending emails?
Yeah, it certainly does. So I would say when you're considering your IP and domain sending reputation, one thing that mailbox providers and spam filters appreciate is consistency. They don't like to see deviations from the norm, and by deviation I would say significantly changing the way you send email by either sending very different content or sending to a very different audience. What they like to see is established good sending reputation and consistent good sending reputation. So any deviation from that is potentially a red flag in their eyes.
Okay.
And I kind of equate that to, like, we've been talking about reputation, and I always like to equate things to real life instances. And, reputation truly is sort of like a credit score, and volume is how many credit cards you're signing up for. And so the more credit cards, right, the more in debt, the more problematic it could be, and the more erratic it looks like on your credit report. So these ISPs, these networks, look for consistency. They count on consistency, and it's really important, especially as you're starting off with a new IP address and warming that up, getting into that consistent volume and pattern, and establishing that will help you truly with reputation and inbox placement.
Cool. And so when we're talking about like sending email to a lot of marketers and stuff, they use ESPs. And so when we're talking about some of the stuff about engagement, IP warming, stuff like that. So I don't, if I'm a marketer and I'm using ESP, isn't that their responsibility to worry about that stuff? So what should the ESP be responsible for?
Well, again, they're responsible for system uptime, making sure the application's up, the database is up, bounces are being processed, unsubscribes are being processed, open and click tracking is being rolled up into the platform, reporting. They're responsible for a lot of the back-end infrastructure and scalability on the platform itself. As far as deliverability goes, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really about, it's a partnership between the marketer and the ESP, but the marketer is responsible for the creative, clean content, engaged content, good quality list, making sure segmentation is done properly, monitoring the reports themselves. Unless you're a full-service client or you're working with an agency, oftentimes you're responsible for looking at daily reports, campaign reports, monitoring the opens, the clicks, the bounces, the complaints, the unsubscribes. That's the role of the marketer. They need to be doing that on a frequent basis to make sure that there's no issues or no problems. And again, each relationship is different. If you're paying for, if you're paying $20 a month versus $2,000 a month, the relationship may be different. Maybe you'll be getting some more of a proactive engagement, maybe proactive reporting. But again, it's truly a partnership that the ESP plays a role, but the marketer has to play that role as well.
Absolutely, and going back kind of to the initial question, the ESP's responsibility really is in that delivery mechanism. So they're responsible for the actual transaction of delivering the message. The deliverability itself is largely determined by the marketer themselves.
Okay, and that's that's really interesting. So on the delivery side, okay. So what can marketers do to manage that delivery from an ESP? Tim, I'll kind of leave this one up to you.
Yeah, I mean, they're the marketer is the one feeding in the information to the ESP. And so what the marketer is controlling is something that's very critical to this process, and that's acquisition of the email address. So if the marketer is feeding bad data into the ESP, the likelihood of delivery taking place is much lower. But if the marketer is feeding good, clean data into the ESP, then everything is going to fall in line, and that's really going to help improve things. So I would say that a lot of this is really in the hands of the marketer. They're the ones feeding the data in, and it doesn't matter which ESP you use. If you feed in a bad address, it's not going to get delivered, regardless of the ESP.
And I would kind of echo that there are some tools out there, tools like 250OK, that do provide you with some insight into seed testing for inbox placement, blacklist monitoring, spam trap monitoring, DMARC reporting, lots of good ISP tools that allow you to kind of look at everything in one dashboard. ESPs may have their own tools or tool sets that you could sign up for or use inside their system. Many of them will have spam checks that may use Spam Assassin to review the content. There are lots of different tools out there that you can use, including Email and Acid, that will help you at least get some insight into what problems there are to be more proactive before you hit the send button.
Absolutely, and with all these tools, there are a lot of data points out there, so it's really important to incorporate the expertise of folks like Chris to really help you navigate through those waters and really decide what is valuable and what is actionable.
Yeah, and I think what you nailed on the head is that actionable side of things, and working with applications that can actually, and people, you Chris, that can actually decipher that information and make it actionable for you, right? And I think that's a big key point. And I think that kind of brings us into the next attendee question that we have for you guys. And we kind of mentioned this a little bit before we mentioned DMARC. And so what we like to ask you guys is hey, do you guys have DMARC set up on your domains? So this is really interesting. So what is DMARC? And so I think this is a really good question to ask. And so 37% said they know what DMARC is. 15% says no, they don't have it set up for the domain. And then 47% said they're not sure what DMARC is. And so, Chris, tell us, what is DMARC?
The first time I heard of this, I thought that it was some sort of technique that, again, black magic, right? DMARC is Domain Messaging Authentication Reporting Conformance. In a nutshell, that means that signing up with a DMARC record on your domain, you can start to receive reports of possible malicious senders or good sources of senders that are using your domain to send email. DMARC allows for these type of reports in XML format, so you can actually review the IPs, you can review volume, you can review platforms maybe on a daily basis. They also have forensic reports that provide additional details. DMARC truly started because PayPal was being phished all the time. I'm sure all of us remember getting the PayPal or Bank of America emails that said, hey, click here to reset your password. And you're thinking to yourself, I don't even have a Bank of America account. So PayPal essentially went to Google, went to Yahoo, and said, we need to come up with a way to fix this. And so a lot of smart people got into a room, and DMARC was born because DMARC takes SPF and DKIM to the next level. SPF and DKIM both being current email authentication metrics that really rely on getting into a network. But DMARC takes those two to the next level. It allows you to monitor by reports all the different sources of IPs that are using your domain, and then you can change that frequency or change that level and say, all right, well, I've included all my sources, so if it doesn't come from me, you can actually switch it to say, send it straight to the junk folder, and then there's also a reject. So you can say, if it doesn't come from me, just bounce it or reject it. So therefore, nobody would try to phish or spoof your brand by domain. And I feel it's very important, and kind of a big stride in not just for deliverability, but for overall brand protection. I would highly recommend any brand or anybody on the call to at least set one up in reporting mode only, so you can start to see other sources or identifiers or malicious sources of people that may be using your domain to send email. Just a quick side note, I've worked with clients quite a bit on setting this up, and oftentimes we will find that maybe sales set up a MailChimp account or a Constant Contact account or some other account to send email that nobody knew about. And so DMARC will show you additional sources of sending volumes and sending infrastructure that's using your domain to send email. So it's very effective to kind of keep an inventory of who's actually using your domain to send email and work to shut that down if it's truly a problem of phishing emails or spoofing emails.
Yeah, and I think with that, too, it kind of goes back to that actionable information. In this one, I'll kind of talk about like 250 OK for a second, because we have DMARC set up, and we get hundreds of DMARC messages sent to us, but tools like 250 OK will take those and put them in easily recordable formats in which you guys can view and see what's happening with the DMARC records. And so I think it's really interesting to do. And so we kind of talked about, the whole thing about, what the responsibility of the ESP and kind of domains and IPs. And so I guess my question for you, Tim, is it worth paying, is it worth paying for like a dedicated IP address for the emails I send out versus having it shared with everyone else through that ESP?
It's an excellent question, and what I would qualify this question with is that, first of all, not everyone has the volume needed to stand up a dedicated IP. So in order for a dedicated IP to even be a viable option, you do certainly have to send a certain amount of email for that to even be a relevant option. But in the event that you do send enough email to be able to have a dedicated IP, I absolutely think it's worthwhile. The reality is, even though domain reputation is becoming more and more important, IP reputation is still a very, very key variable. And because it is a key variable, you want to control that IP reputation yourself. You don't want to be reliant on other senders over an IP. So in a perfect world, if you have the volume needed to do it, I would absolutely recommend going with a dedicated IP. You'll control your own email reputation at that point, and that's the best way to move forward.
Cool. But it is more expensive, though, so that kind of gets into that whole, what Chris has mentioned about like what kind of platform or what services you have for your ESP. And so if you have client services or you have dedicated IPs, it's just an added expense, but it kind of puts value on what that means to you guys, like what it means to control your own destiny, for instance.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is that sometimes depending upon the shared IPs or pools that you're in, again, if one person, if their list happens to cause an issue and land the entire IP or IP pool in a blacklist, of course that affects you. And so having, for larger brands or those brands that have a larger sending volume, getting a dedicated IP will kind of isolate you or shield you. But then again, it also means that you are now responsible solely for your own reputation. And so that's also kind of a point of contention for some people, is they may not want to do that. And kind of second to that, most IT people, especially those that you're working with trying to get whitelisted at their particular domain or network, most IT people will be more willing to whitelist one dedicated IP than if you gave them like 3 or 30 or 300.
Interesting. And so I'm glad you mentioned something about blacklists and stuff like that, and we've mentioned it a couple times. So Tim, why don't you kind of define for me like what a blacklist is and what are the different types of blacklists?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different types of blacklists. At a high level, there are really two different types. Number one is going to be IP-based, which is the more common, and then number two is going to be a domain-based blacklist. In each case, what a blacklist is something that is usually driven by spam traps, and once you are listed on a blacklist, that is then passed to mailbox providers and spam filters, who then take that listing into account. So the most commonly known blacklist is of course Spamhaus. If you're listed on Spamhaus, what it's typically going to do is cause about 75% of the email you send to get blocked. And obviously not every blacklist will have that type of impact, but That's why it's worthwhile to pay attention to blacklists, because it certainly can have a detrimental impact on your ability to deliver email.
Wow, so you mentioned 75%. So whose responsibility, Chris, on your end, like whose responsibility is it to monitor these and make sure that you're not listed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that typically if you get listed on Spam House, your email service provider is going to reach out to you and say, we're going to stop sending your volume, we're going to pause your account, we're going to look at your lists and creative and sort of figure out what happened. I would say that's number one. So Spam House is a major blacklist that gets the attention of every email service provider. There are a lot of smaller to mid-sized blacklists that, of course, will affect you depending upon if you're a B2C sender or B2B sender. I would pay attention to the reports from your ESP, looking at the soft bounces specifically. If you start to see spikes in soft bounces or issues dealing with certain types of soft bounces, maybe due to a certain category the ESP has set up, you want to pay attention to that. But also, using a tool like 250OK, you can sign up both your IP and domain to get sort of alerts when and if you do land on both a low, medium, or high blacklist. And it's, I would like to kind of throw out that it's not just about IP blacklists, but there are also domain blacklists. So if your domain gets on a blacklist, of course, it could affect you possibly even more if there's issues with your links or your image path domains or landing pages. And worse, if you're using your corporate domain to send out emails, it could also affect your corporate domain or your internal mail server domain on top of your marketing domain.
Interesting. And so, and we mentioned this too, and real quick before we get, because we're kind of running short here into the QA, like we mentioned a couple times like spam traps, and we mentioned it, with blacklists and reputation and engagement. So can one of you guys define what a spam trap is? Is it like something that you catch with a mouse? Like, what is it?
So I can take the first pass at that. So as far as a spam trap, there are different types of spam traps. And so with 250OK in particular, we have 3 different classifications. The first is going to be pristine. So this is an address that has never opened or clicked anything at any point in time. Those are generally going to be the most serious. The second type we look at is going to be typo. So that's going to be something like yahoo.com with 3 O's. Obviously a different root cause of hitting that one. And then the third and probably the less serious variety is going to be the recycled addresses. And so what those are is addresses that were at one point in time valid and active, but have since lapsed and have gone stale.
Interesting. Okay. Well, awesome. So now what we're going to do is kind of go into the QA. I've just been kind of looking through some questions here, and I think one of them is, a lot of them are really good questions. And so I'll go with Gmail is a huge challenge. Will you be giving specific tactics to overcome this? And we get this here at Email and Asset. We get this question a lot. So like Gmail, how do we get it to the inbox?
Yeah, I would say that, just kind of tackling Gmail, right? Gmail is looking at lots of different pieces of data. They're looking at, again, not IP reputation, more focused on domain reputation. So that sending domain, that landing page domain, are you using it for other purposes, other platforms? Has it been phished, that particular domain, which could, of course, cause deliverability problems? Focus in on that domain reputation. Gmail looks at subdomain reputation as well. And so segmenting out your different types of content, your different mail streams by subdomain will help you at least kind of identify by subdomain which one may be more problematic or which list may be more difficult as far as inbox placement. They also look at history. They look at patterns. So if you create a new subdomain today and start sending emails, it's not going to be warmed up. It's not going to have any reputation. Gmail is going to look at that and say, this doesn't seem right. I've seen this content before. This top-level domain kind of looks familiar, but the subdomain is brand new. Let me throw some emails in the junk folder and see if anybody goes in and clicks this is not spam. So they're kind of looking at all that. Gmail, of course, wants SPF, DKIM, and DMARC set up. Again, heavily focused on anti-phishing techniques. If you are seeing deliverability problems at Gmail, One thing to do is, of course, focus on the opens, the clicks, maybe pulling back some of the older segments. You'll quickly get into the inbox, but then it's building back up that engagement, that reputation of opens and clicks to help boost you back into the inbox for all of your other emails. But again, it's about categorizing, taking inventory of what you currently have, maybe setting up different types of infrastructure that's going to be beneficial for your overall campaigns, and then focus on the list segmentation to get you back into the inbox.
And then, so you talked about domain quite a bit. We talked about it, like, the domain blacklists and domain monitoring and stuff like that. So Rob asked the question is, do different subdomains count as separate domains, or are they considered to be the same domain? And Tim, I don't know if you want to take that one.
So it really depends. It depends on who's looking at the domain reputation, but subdomains can absolutely have their own domain reputation attributed to them, but in a lot of cases what people will do is they will anchor that together into a top-level domain. So I don't know, and Chris, you probably are closer to the fire here when you see this, but I certainly have seen scenarios where one subdomain will get to the inbox, whereas one subdomain will not.
Yeah, and that happens quite a bit, especially transactional traffic versus your bulk marketing traffic. So, for instance, if you've got a top-level domain of like Disney and you're getting your receipts, you want to set up a separate subdomain for your transactional emails, receipts.disney.com, and then your newsletter, maybe go off newsletter.disney.com. They're treating that separately and different because they know that your transactional traffic should be treated differently because it is purely transactional, not bulk. And so having the separate subdomains is helpful for inbox placement. But if you are, of course, sending to lots of traps, maybe getting on a blacklist, sending to lots of bounces, that reputation can roll up into the top level, which could affect other sends or other streams of traffic.
Awesome. And so we have time for just one more question. And there's been a lot of great questions asked. So what we'll do is we'll follow up with those once we're done here. But the final question I want to ask is, I think this is a really good one. So which would be better, sending a list at one time or throttle it throughout the day? Because some ESPs say sending in chunks every other hour is better. So what is your guys' recommendation?
So I'll start. I think, first of all, it kind of also depends upon more of a strategy behind it and say, okay, well, if you're a B2C sender, your ESP already has all the rate limits and connection settings on the mail server. So whenever you do send it, and if you send it in chunks and you throttle it throughout the day, it's actually sending correctly, opening the connections, delivering the proper amount of email, opening a new connection, time of day testing, or maybe help, because of course then you may get to the top of their inbox. If you're and then segmenting that out over the course of a day or a couple days or even 3 days, so that way you're not hitting a B2B domain or a small network too much too fast. They may look at you like you're trying to send a denial of service attack because you're sending thousands of emails to one small domain that has one mail server. So segmenting that up, chunking that up, and throttling that could help even just bypass some of that network filtering or volume filtering sending to the small domains.
I think one thing to point out there, too, is the fact that it all depends on the timeliness of that email as well, right? So if you have something that's very timely, and that's, they have some urgent out or urgent sale or something that you want to get out to your subscribers, that might not be the best option. But if you have something like that's more informational or whatever, then throttling it could definitely help that deliverability. So awesome. Well, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Tim and Chris, for joining us today. Your wisdom and your knowledge in the domain is greatly appreciated. And I hope everyone had a great time. And we will be recording this, or we have been recording this, and we'll be sending it out to you guys in the next couple of days. And we'll try to follow up with some of these questions as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.